Thank you, Raki. I think you set it up brilliantly for Sridhar. All Sridhar you need to do is to tell us what you're going to do about it, and we can all go home in Bihar at least. So just to verbalize that, I think that the last question which Raki is leaving us with, which is the system-wide quality improvement, and how we are looking at this entire journey, right from what do you want to do with the nurse mentoring itself in the facility, then the larger QI within the facility, and then beyond the facility through the continuum of care.
Okay. I probably don't need to use slides at all, since they were suggesting that we actually move to the next point. I think, we have heard from the two previous speakers about what kind of changes have happened over time. So what is it that we do not know? We don't have direct evidence yet of, therefore, has nurse mentoring impacted mortality rates exactly in what, which particular cause has been, cause of death has been impacted, and what has been the reduction in mortality rates, if at all. There are several reasons for this. We have, for example, most of the measurements that we have are, it's relatively easy to go and observe what's happening in a normal delivery. To quantify what happens in complications is extremely difficult, because of even in a scale like Bihar and the fertility rate of Bihar, we still have too few complications to be able to set up viable measurement mechanisms to be present at the time when actually a complication happens, and then document it in such a manner that that makes sense, in where you can quantify what interventions have actually caused change. So there are limitations to that. Both previous speakers, they have referred to systemic interventions and quality improvement overall. The nurse mentoring program that we did in Bihar, that is, when I'm using the past tense because in the future we're moving to a slightly different model. So the model that we followed was one of providing about 40 to 50 days of exposure to nurse mentoring, of nurse mentoring on site, on the job, in labor rooms, by qualified nurses coming in from outside, with all the limitations that Yarka talked about in the morning. They themselves are not fully experienced, the mentors themselves, so we need to give them a period of training during which we try to bring them up to speed as much as possible before sending them out there to actually provide the mentoring. So with all those limitations, the period of nurse mentoring that we provided at that time, the rest of approximately 600 facilities across Bihar. So we are actually talking about approximately, at that time, therefore 45% of deliveries in Bihar were happening already in public facilities, driven largely by the GSY, the maternity, the cash incentives, and there was virtually nothing of that could be described as any level of quality in most of the facilities, and therefore most of the nurses were not yet ready to start delivering babies. They had come in, half of them unqualified, the other half had been there for a long time but had never delivered babies. So there was nothing in terms of skills, there's hardly anything in terms of infrastructure and supplies. So starting from virtually nothing, they were coming and delivering in the equivalent of cow sheds with no skills available. So from there, we had to do something in an emergency, and therefore this particular mentoring program was actually meant to, over a period of a relatively short period, take them to a point where at least some basic care of some quality could be provided. And that is what seems to have, if at all, if it has provided, provided some impact, and Tanmay and Raki showed some slides there to show what kind of indicators. Most of the basic service indicators have improved over a period of time. So could this have already produced some impact? Do we have anything to say that this could have produced impact, and what are the specific interventions that could have? One thing that has definitely come down has really changed substantially is the level of abuse of oxytocin, particularly oxytocin and other oxytocics, and also physical pushing. this was a nearly universal practice when we came in. It's very difficult to find a delivery where this had not been, that this was not happening. And the last the last measurement that we have on that suggests that it is now way below 20%. So that itself should have impacted particularly, see, there are two big killers that, as we all know, PPH and asphyxia, and of course the associated stillbirths. And these could have been affected by these interventions. AMSTIL has become, again, from zero, it has gone up to almost universal, in the sense, at least in public facilities where mentoring has happened, AMSTIL is happening. Even if it is not perfect, oxytocin is being administered to most women. PPH management, basic knowledge has improved. You can see go and talk to any mentored nurse in Bihar. She'll be able to tell you something about how fluids and oxytocin can be given to manage PPH. And many referrals appear to be happening with some level of complications. Cesarean section rates have doubled. Blood availability has improved. So there are a number of reasons why mortality rates could actually have actually gone down. What is it that it might have actually affected? And do we have, have these interventions likely to have reached a scale in Bihar to affect population level mortality rates? We believe it's possible because public sector deliveries have kind of increased now to about 60%, as I said. So those are receiving, have received some kind of mentoring interventions, most of them, at least 400 of the highest delivery load facilities out of the 550 have received the nurse mentoring program, including 23 district hospitals. But at the base of it is something that is what we've been calling QI, that they've referred to. Essentially, it's an ongoing process of a block manager and our district level teams who are not nurse mentors, who are not technical people, but who are constantly at the job of reminding the hospital staff, nurses and doctors of what they ought to be doing, what happened during nurse mentoring, are you continuing those practices or not, and so on. And the nurses keep getting transferred from one facility to other facility, so there's some level of diffusion also happening. And since we have covered most facilities now, most facilities do have mentored nurses. Are these interventions good enough to have reduced mortality rates? Some of the practices that when we started off were so bad that we were probably having more mortality in facility births than even home deliveries. Infection rates were horrendous, and malpractices I've referred to. Today it's almost difficult, almost impossible to find the kind of, the cowsheds that I described. You can't find such a facility now in Bihar, even if you want to show somebody what it's like. And while these practices in public facilities improved vastly over a period of time, the proportion of women delivering in public facilities has simultaneously increased. So there's been a multiplier effect over there, and you can see the level of confidence, etc., going up. So let me come to, therefore, from where we are, what is it that we can do to improve things further? One thing that I refer to the oxytocin abuse that has to come down even further, asphyxia management has to improve further. So there are some ongoing, unfinished agenda that has to be completed. One intervention that we have found great purchase with apparently, and we only have serial data on that, is that identifying babies who are less than 2 kilos in weight at birth in public facilities and then following them up, basically telling the parents that your baby is weak and requires extra care, and supporting that through ashas, going to their homes and all of that. We have seen, for reasons that we are not fully able to explain, nearly a 50% reduction in mortality in that particular age group. That is, babies born less than 2 kilos in public facilities in Bihar have experienced a mortality rate which is substantially lower than what it used to be. But that the residual mortality from that, because that even today approximately 30% of babies are dying of complications of prematurity and about 45% of asphyxia. So these two definitely remain centerpieces of the agenda, even though neonatal mortality rates have fallen. CMONG centers are not still up to speed at all, and we need to do something over there in terms of the triaging and emergency response overall. We still don't know. We have a fairly good idea now about what is killing neonates and even post-neonates, but we don't have a good quantitative idea of what is actually killing mothers at a population scale, and we need to understand more of that. Rakhi has referred to the clinical documentation that needs to vastly improve, and that's one function that has to improve substantially if you want to really get a handle of what's happening to complications and whether they're being managed well or not. Referral and blood banking services, of course. So finally, all of these in some way are a continuation of that emergency response that we started when we, 6 or 7 years ago. But we need to move beyond that. And that is where probably most of the next level of effort needs to go into. It is not just about nurse mentoring happening for these 6 to 8 weeks or 6 to 8 months or whatever. It needs to be institutionalized in some way to make sure that not just, we're not talking only of saying, okay, can a few practices improve to a certain extent, but what is that mechanism within the system that sustains those improvements and in fact is able to incorporate future interventions as well in a manner that is effective and is operational at scale. Yerkar was referring to midwifery cadres. When are we going to get a midwifery cadre in India? I don't know. We might not get and even if such a cadre is developed in the future, it will take probably another 10 to 15 years for it to actually become functional on the ground. Until then, what do we do? So one thing that we are proposing is to create mentors within government hospital staff themselves and get them mentored to be mentors and have fairly large teams, say about 15, 20 such mentors among nurses in each district, and add to that over a period of time doctor mentors as well. So by the government recognizing some of their staff as recognized mentors and supporting them over a long period of time, we are hoping to create a sustainable mechanism for mentoring where we become redundant, we can move out, and through different mechanisms, the government itself can take it forward. We haven't done enough for the private sector. I mean, not done almost anything with the private sector. Private sector has improved in Bihar over the last so many years, but not as much as the public sector. For private sector performance, almost in any of these indicators is half or less than that of equivalent public sector facilities. So private sector deliveries definitely, they need to do something. But then 80% of cesarean sections are happening in private facilities, and we need to do something about that. Otherwise, we are probably losing opportunities to save women at the CMONC level by not tapping into that. And it's a bit of a dream to keep talking about QI only for intrapartum care. District hospitals, even PHCs, all kinds of patients come. And unless the overall emergency response, the ability to respond to any kind of medical or surgical emergency, unless that is strong, we are actually trying to create islands of excellence in the middle of a lot of problems. So we need to really expand this to beyond just intrapartum care. So I'll just stop there and we can take questions.
Thank you, Sridhar. Can I now request Abha to please tell us more from your experience in Bihar, and also what perhaps will never work or has not worked, and what are the lessons we have drawn to inform our future work?
Thank you, Deb. I'll try not to be repetitive, but I think in the earlier discussion that we had, the second facilitated conversation, and even now that what I was seeing in Rakhi's presentation, I could see a lot of the similar themes coming out, which have been some of the lessons that we have learned. We've been working with Care India and 10 district hospitals in strengthening quality of labor and delivery processes. And I'll try to maybe explain some of the lessons learned from Dr. Edward Deming's theory of the lens of profound knowledge. So I do not know how many of you are familiar with Dr. Deming. Well, he's one of the fathers of quality improvement. Was not actually working in health, but interestingly, though those principles were something that he was looking into manufacturing industry, they very, very easily can be related to what the conversation that we have been having since morning. So there were 4 main lenses, and the first one I would say is about human behavior and human psychology. I think I've been hearing over and over again about the need to engage with doctors and nurses and frontline workers. We cannot go into a facility and just tell people they need to do better. If they knew how to, they probably would. And unless we can build their capability and help them, this problem is not going to go away. And it's difficult to engage people because I have not heard since in the morning discussions some of the problems that we are facing with the incentives in the opposite direction for the nurses and doctors to behave the way they are doing. There are financial incentives. There are financial incentives on why the nurses are giving oxytocin, because she wants the woman to deliver in her shift because she'll get some extra money. There are incentives for the doctor not to be present in the facility because he's got their own private practice, or to take the patient out to their private practice. So there are a lot of other problems. Having said that, I think, and this is what I would say maybe from the experience, is that the situation is not hopeless. I mean, when we started working out, and we had a collaborative where we had teams of 10 district hospitals coming in, nobody had actually signed up for doing this QI, which is very different from what we do in other places. We've done a similar QI with some very good institutions in the country where clinic leaders wanted to improve their outcomes. But we had these 10 teams of hospitals coming up, and an order was sent from the state government, you need to come and attend this meeting, and you need to maybe work on improving clinical outcomes. And there wasn't enough buy-in. And I think most of our initial time went just building the will and building the buy-in on why this work is important. Because until people really care about these outcomes that we want to improve, things are not going to get better. The first thing is building the will. The second thing is about is it even possible in the system? Because the first time we met, it was just about why it is not possible to do it. A lot of the problems that we're talking about, with them saying that not even a single process is reliable. You're telling to get a series of processes made reliable so that the clinical outcome for the mother and newborn improves. And it needs maybe somebody to step forward and say, let me try in my facility and see if I can do it. And as a part of the collaborative, we were talking yesterday about shared learning, having other hospitals see if one hospital actually tried it and it worked, a clinical leader came forward, and then learning how they did it. The second thing I would want to say is that it's also important to understand the healthcare providers are working in very difficult circumstances. So when we started facilitating opening up of conversation between frontline teams and administration, the nurses came out with problems like, you're so concerned about the patient. During the hot summer, I don't even have a fan over me working. I don't have safe drinking water. There isn't a toilet for me to go to. So until we're able to address the systemic problems and why the provider is not doing better, we had doctors coming up and saying that I'm the only doctor who's expected to be on duty throughout the month, and I just cannot face it. I just cannot come and see that I cannot really do enough. So I mean, the provider has their own perspective as well, and until there is a dialogue and an engagement for administration to resolve these problems, we are not going to be able to engage them. That's what I would say. And over a period of time, I think empowerment comes with building capacity on how to do QI. QI is not just some tools, but it's actually application of what they're doing in their day-to-day work, on having them understand how can they, in a systematic problem, look at their problems, find local solutions. Most of the answers are there in the facility. They know their problems best, they know their solutions best, and empowering them to understand and look at their data. And until we're able to facilitate that conversation, I think improvement will not happen. I'm sorry I spent a lot of time just talking about human behavior, but I think it's really important. And we have found different types of clinical champions coming forward. From one facility where the hospital manager came forward and brought a team around him, to a doctor who was not in he was not an obstetrician, he was not in any administrative position, came up and said to me, I think for the first time I feel something can be done. I'm telling you we'll go back and we will apply all this to nurse leaders who have gone back to the facility and done things differently. So it's very, very important for us to engage with these frontline teams. The second thing which I would also, the second lens which I would talk about, which has been a recurring theme, is about the appreciation of a system. It's a very complex system, and we heard that about complexity in the mothers seeking delayed care at primary center, problems with the referral, problems with the facility not being able to do it because it has not got the resources, which might be linked to what is happening at the state level. And the problems, some of the problems are deep-seated. And I think one of the fantastic things with the program that we're doing, which the foundation is supporting and which Care India is doing, is that they're working at different levels within the system. There is work that's happening at state level with advocacy. There is work that's happening at the facility level. So for example, if I'm struggling to give AMTSL within the appropriate time because oxytocin is not in supply, some of the problems could be with the central procurement of oxytocin and its distribution to the district level, and then from the district store down to how it's reaching the facilities. These are deep-seated problems. And until we are able to be cognizant of the complexity of the system, we cannot have banded treatments for these problems. And being cognizant of these deep-seated problems and engaging leadership at different levels, because unless we are able to have that dialogue with leadership, a lot of the common problems which are related to input, to HR, to training, these are not going to be resolved. And there are a lot of examples how engaging leadership, even sometimes at the district level, and definitely at the state level, have helped resolve these problems. The third thing, I think, which everybody has reiterated is the importance of understanding variation. The ability to understand what the data is telling us. We've been reiterating that we need to have better case records, we need to have, but that's not going to happen until if I'm the nurse who's sitting on the counter and filling up sheets and sheets of report, which probably get sort of carried forward and reported somewhere, and I'm not having the ability to synthesize it, to understand why this information is important. And until that capacity is built, the data recording or reporting, I doubt, is going to improve. So building that local capacity to look at variation, and then looking at variation also in terms of comparing how the facilities are performing, and identifying facilities where they're turning towards benchmarking practices so that we can learn how in the unique context that they were able to do better than the others. And the fourth and not the last lens, is the theory of knowledge. And I was telling Deb, you've asked me to speak, and I said I probably can speak more about how not to do it, because we fail so many times, and we learn so much on how not to do it to make it work. And I think there is a wealth of information that we are now applying differently. And I think one of the biggest lessons that we learned in our initial work is that the work needs to be owned by the system. We are people from outside coming and telling the doctors and the nurses or the government system or the administrators to do better. Until this is owned by the government system, right from senior level leadership down to the frontline worker working, this is not going to work. And I think this is what our ongoing current efforts right now are. So I'll just stop here. I hope I've not taken too much time.
Thank you so much, Ava. That was very interesting. We do have some follow-up questions. I'm going to ask Kirti now to actually, Kirti, you are kind of looking at this, hearing this from the perspective of another state right now. I'm talking about Rajasthan. And what are your reflections based on your experience on the ground in Rajasthan? What do you think are important innovations that we should be diffusing to other states or other parts of the country? And what are we learning from other contexts that we should be bringing to Bihar?
I think the previous four speakers have really left very stimulating thoughts with all of us. And, like there are so many random thoughts that I have, and they are not in any sequence, so pardon my whatever I share with you. So one of the important questions that I think has been coming since the morning conversations and presentations has been that which model of nurse training is effective, and what is it that we need to follow. We know about the SBA training, which is a 21-day very intensive training, versus the on-site mentoring training. There are pluses and minuses of both. And people who have seen both the models closely, they know that there are various difficulties for nurses to leave their sites for 21 days to come and learn. There are nomination issues. The people who don't work, they are sent for such trainings very often, and the people who are very busy are not sent. At the same time, in the on-site mentoring training, we have learned and we have also seen that there are issues of the mentors themselves. Are the mentors themselves very experienced? Have they really dealt with serious complications? And to what extent will they be able to mentor the people whom they are meeting? And there are also pluses of the SPA training approach that I have seen. I'm not saying everything is perfect with them. With that approach, there are pluses because when people are brought away to a different setting, they are able to talk freely about the barriers that they face, while when they are within the same context, they are not able to share the barriers that they are facing. At the same time, they are able to unlearn some of the wrong practices that they had been doing, and they are able to learn new practices, behaviors, as well as skills. And also what we have found on the basis of my experience on SPA training is that sometimes, since morning we have been discussing on some of the evidence-based practices. Rita raised the point about the upright position of delivery. So these are some of the things which can be taught to, or like the nurses should be trained into those in a SPA training module. In the on-site mentoring, I don't have that much experience as to what extent you can do that, but of course there are very valid reasons to do on-site mentoring because you can reach the people who are really doing majority of the work, and you don't really get the people who are in the system only for last 2 months. But one of the bigger issues that I think we have been discussing since morning is about the various quality assurance systems and how to make them sustainable and effective. I think this question has been coming repeatedly, and various speakers have spoken about various quality assurance systems. One of the questions that I have been, thinking about for last some years has been what kind of quality assurance system is going to work in a system like ours in India. Whether it should be internal, where the people who drove for quality monitoring, they are from the system, but we know they are terribly busy people. Generally, the people who are members of the quality assurance committees are very busy CMHOs or rheumatologists or surgeons who are nominated to be the DQAC members. They don't really get time. Their visits are not as very, very infrequent, sometimes once a year or once in 8 months. And when they go there, what they are looking for is something different. They are not really looking at those evidence-based practices. They are looking at some other performance indicators which we did not really intend to look at. On the other hand, the evidence from other parts where there have been a little more successful quality assurance systems have shown that an external or independent quality assurance body works better. I think in NHS there is an external independent quality assurance process, and they have also found that a regular presence of an external quality assurance team really helps to maintain a better quality. So we have to seriously think as to what kind of quality assurance model we need to have in our especially maternal newborn health improvement. The other issue I think which has been raised by many speakers, and Dr. Sridhar spoke very clearly about it, is what are we looking at when we look at the quality assurance, and especially in maternal newborn health. So the childbirth checklist, for example, looks at several positive behaviors which should be followed, but there are so many behaviors which are harmful practices, and some of our quality assurance systems in maternal newborn care are not really looking at that. So augmentation of labor, unnecessary fundal pressure, and these are the practices that are rampant. They are in more than 90% of delivery, and there is research which has shown that, and we know how they are linked to the perinatal mortality. But several of our quality assurance checklists don't cover those aspects. So do we need to have a relook at our quality assurance checklists and expand the scope a bit to add some of those harmful behaviors that they are not practiced? Because even if you follow all the correct behaviors, if you don't stop the harmful behaviors, then the effect on mortality will not come. And probably when the presentation in the morning by Catherine mentioned that there were better practices but really not impact on mortality, I had this thought in mind. The other thought that I have in mind is about, most of our quality assurance processes, they are looking at the facility, but we have to go a little beyond the facility. For example, the maternal death reviews. And we all know that, you know, when a woman is on the verge of death, the facilities refer them out so that she dies in transport. And she doesn't die at the facility, because the provider knows that if there is a maternal death review of my facility, I should have a 0 maternal death, and that's the situation in many of the facilities. So when we do a maternal death review, it should not be the facility-based review, it should be the system-based. So if a woman dies in transit within half hour of being referred out, it means she should not have been referred at that point. Or sufficient support was not, or maybe she should have been referred much earlier, so that she reached the net facility in time to be saved. And very often we have, like I have a lot of experience of also being involved with the verbal autopsies of maternal deaths, and one other scenario that occurs very often is that the family is referred out to a higher level of facility but not provided the kind of referral transport that she should have been provided. So they go home to gather the money so that they could go to the higher level facility, and in the process, by the time those 6 to 8 hours they are collecting the money to go to a higher level facility, the woman dies. So, you know, those are also the deaths that should be investigated and should be considered the responsibility of the system somewhere. And that brings me to another thought that I have seen, that in maternal death reviews, we all know that very few proportion of maternal deaths are actually reported in the system, in our HMS system, and are investigated. But even those that are investigated, I would say the people who are involved in those audit processes or the review processes, they are quite insensitive to the family's realities. They are generally trying to put the responsibility for all the things going wrong on the families, and trying to ensure that the health system is safe, because they are from the system. So even for maternal death review, do we need to look at a slightly different system of maternal death review? Do we need mentors for the people who are conducting the reviews? Who are, like, I'm sure Rita and Aditi have lots of thoughts on that, who are able to sensitize these people on, you know, how to do an objective review of the maternal deaths. And similarly, when we are talking of course, we have had a lot of thoughts on the nurses, but also we know that there are doctors. And we know what happens, you know, in some of the district hospitals where the C-sections do take place in reality, there is a quota that each doctor will get to do about 2 C-sections. So if a woman is in labor between 9 a.m. to 1 p.m., there is a fairly high chance that she would go through a C-section, and each doctor finishes their 2 cesareans, and sometimes women who are waiting in the, you know, on the trolley to be taken inside the OT, they get delivered. So obviously they didn't need a C-section. So when we are doing all these quality assurance processes, we also need to bring in some of the quality assurance of, for example, the C-section audit. So these are just some thoughts, you know, I would not, like I have already shared lots of my thoughts, and I think we need to discuss some of these questions.
Well, what we're going to do is, Deb and I have a couple of questions that we're going to pose to our panelists, and then we'll open it up. So, Abha, you talked about changing human behavior, and that's also something we've been hearing since the morning. You know, we've talked about it in terms of motivation, or it's the unobservable. In different ways, we keep talking about changing human behavior. And I think most of us have kind of somewhere alluded to that. And my question is this going to be a function of positive outliers? Or is it something that can be truly institutionalized in our health system strengthening work? If any of you want to take, and the questions that we're going to pose to you all, I would request we do very quick responses and not long, lengthy responses. Just your very quick, igniting thoughts around this.
Well, thank you. Well, I think it will, to begin with, as we say, it starts with with a very small group of people who are willing to try this out, what we normally call the innovators, who will think this is a good idea, who are can associate with the cause that we are working, and it's actually a small group of people. Not everybody's going to be excited about what we're doing. They've been doing this for decades, and nobody likes change. Nobody except a wet baby. Nobody wants a change. And
What you're saying is that this cannot necessarily be institutionalized.
No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that it begins with a small group of people. And when they are able to show results, and when there is data to support it, people are just standing there. Some of them are just standing and waiting for them to prove. And I think that we've crossed that small piece of from the innovators to getting results to having more people join in on the campaign that, yes, this is something worthwhile, this can happen here. When about nearly 50% of the people actually move in that direction, we can normally call it as a tipping over, where this doing things the right way becomes the norm. Because right now the norm is not being present in the clinic, not doing it, it doesn't matter. And until we reach that, it cannot be institutionalized.
Great.
So it's a slow process, but it has already begun.
Excellent. Dave, you had a
Thanks,
question?
Abha. In spite of the post-lunch stupor, Sridhar and Tanmay, don't think that we have not noticed your sartorial, excellent sartorial alignment. And my question
they're
is that,
dressed
is it,
similarly.
I know it is impeccable, but it is coincidental. So how coincidental is this internalization or institutionalization of QI efforts within the system? And how much more will your kurta fade before it comes back to the original color?
Even though his question was long, we want a shorter response than the question is.
I think it's, see, with what we have found, not just on this, but on many other domains, is that it's a question of how persistently you can remain engaged with the system, with different actors within the system. And you definitely come to a tipping point where things become a common practice. I mean, all the data that Tanmay was presenting about what has changed in labor rooms in Bihar, it would be impossible to predict if you were 6-7 years ago that would not have changed. So that has got institutionalized. So many things have got institutionalized. It's just that when we talk of intrapartum care, what we want is the management of maternal complications, for example, to be institutionalized, and that is tough without involving doctors as well as nurses and centers that are designated CMONC centers. So we need to have that sharp focus and keep hammering away at the right actors in the governance structure to make that happen.
I have a question for you, but go ahead.
I have a question for Sridhar. You talked about in-service training and how we could, continue to go about doing it. I'm thinking 5 years from now. When will we have a system where we are not doing in-service training of these nurses for the basics that we are talking about today? When will we have a system where they will actually come trained in for all this that we are talking about today, and your definition of in-service training would actually be different?
Yeah, I wish my answer could be simply that yes, say 3 years from now or 5 years from now, we'll actually reach a point. Particularly for clinical care, I think most of us actually learn clinical care over much longer periods than the current durations of training that nurses undergo. For example, even GNMs undergo 1.5-2 years of training. That is probably not sufficient given, and particularly if you want, I mean, as was being referred to, how many deliveries are they actually conducting? It's not just a question of conducting delivery, it's a question of managing complications again. When are they going to learn all that? So I don't think we can really rely on pre-service training alone. Of course, we need to improve the quality of pre-service training. We want them to come in a little better prepared than definitely the kind of ANMs came prepared in Bihar, no question about it. But we need to have an ongoing mentoring or learning mechanism that will keep the staff in hospitals continuously keep improving. I think that is how, for example, good teaching hospitals have maintained standards. And unless we replicate that in virtually all, at least the secondary level hospitals in the public system, or for that matter even private, we will not be able to. So it's a long-term thing and it has to be ongoing.
So I have a question for the panel, 2 questions, anybody can answer. The first one is, just relating what we heard in the morning, issues around equity, dignity, person-centered care. When we now kind of reflect back upon some of those concepts back into the nurse mentoring program and how we are doing QI efforts in Bihar, where do we see that as a driver for improved quality of care? Really looking at person-centered care, and where would we position that in our intervention? So maybe Sridhar, you want to answer that. And to Kirti and Rakhi, I want to ask, you know, you talked about different ways of looking at data, clinical record management. Kirti, you talked about independent external evaluators. And Rakhi talked about much more clinical records and internal systems of data. And I want you to reflect on, are these both important in equal measure, or what is it that we must do right now in terms of our data systems?
Dr. Sridhar's requested me to talk about person-centered care. So I think, so we normally say person-centered care for two reasons. The provider is important and the patient is important as well. That's why it's a person, not just patient-centered care. Because I already spoke about the provider, I'll talk about the patient now. I think the patient will become the center of care only when the provider starts caring for the patient and for the outcome. And then again, making the provider engaged and care enough is probably the most important thing which we are right now working and doing. Because until we deeply care about the mother, that she's treated well, we are able to empathize with her, this is not going to change. And I'll just give an example of this. So we've been trying to share stories to have people sort of open up on why it is important. And we recently had just give an example, I take a little bit of time. We recently had a workshop where we had hospital managers and district superintendents come in, and we were teaching them QI tools and methods. And at the end of day one, we got such an overwhelming amount of feedback. They just didn't know why they were here, why this was important, why are they in this workshop. So we started day two. I started with a story to try and tell why this work is important. Why it's important for the care to be safe? Why is it important for it to be given with dignity and quality? I will not go into the story. But on one of my field visits in one of the district hospitals, the hospital manager came up and he's pretty brilliant, and came up and said, "Ma'am, I have a story very similar to what you shared. I lost my mother and I lost my sister-in-law about 10 years back in the same year. And I was not able to access healthcare. I started as a data entry operator in a private hospital, went on, became a hospital manager, and just shared a story. And he said, I really want to make a difference. And until we're able to engage people and have them really care about why this is important, I don't think we're going to achieve that person-centered care."
Can I just quickly add? See, ultimately what matters is, from a patient, for example, I mean, providers we have probably talked about, and we could talk much more about that also. And providers are very important. We have not been paying enough attention to providers, no question about it. We need to pay more attention. But even from the patient perspective, what really matters is what is the change that they are perceiving over time. We maybe people in this room might have a certain standard in our minds, which we think all facilities should come up to. From the point of view of people who are coming to the facilities, for example, mothers who come to the facilities to deliver, they are looking at what they experienced before and how different is it today. And if that difference is something that is positive, they feel satisfied, even though we might say it is very poor. Just to give one small example, one story that I've probably told before, and maybe some of you have heard this. Many years ago, when we were still new to Bihar, in one of the subdivisional hospitals, basically less than a district hospital in Bihar, one of the staff from the State Health Society had gone out there to some kind of an inspection visit, found the whole thing in a very messy situation. The labor room was very dirty. It had not been cleaned for a long time, and so on and so forth. So he went around, calling the nurse and the sweepers and everybody, and basically scolding them and saying, just get everything cleaned up immediately. I want to see all this clean. So that went on for maybe half an hour, and afterwards he noticed that one woman who was in labor over there, in fact, she had just delivered, she was crying, and he got alarmed. He said, why is she crying? So he went and asked her, did I upset you? Did I shout too loudly? Whatever it was. So she said, no. These are tears of joy because I see that you're doing so much for my baby, so that my baby remains safe. So people's perception of how, what is quality of care could be just a difference between what they have seen before and now.